Alright, I've been looking forward to this day for a long time. Now beside me are two almost identical 8th generation Civic Sis. This is my FA5, the 4-door SI. This is my friend Alex's FG2, the 2-door SI. And why did I bring two otherwise almost identical Civic Sis out to the canyons today? Well, for a fun comparison. You see, this has a stock K20 Z3 engine under the hood, the last of the high-revving Hondas, 8,300 RPM stock, capable of almost 9,000 RPM modified. That's really exciting. This 8th generation Civic Si has traded its K20 Z3 for a torquier K24 engine out of an Acura TSX. And today, we're gonna see which is more fun. So Alex, tell us a bit more about this engine. Where exactly did this come from? How did you do the K24 swap? Why the K24 swap?
All right, so this K24 swap actually came from Redline JDM Motors in Ontario, California. We sourced it out of a Honda Odyssey Absolute. It has less than 100,000 miles on it, and it was a really healthy engine. We actually got it installed by my friend at Lahan Automotive in Santa Ana, California. And the reason we got the K24 swap is actually because the K20 went out on me. It actually hydrolocked itself, and we think it's because when we changed out the head gasket, the head bolts actually backed out and coolant went into the cylinders and it destroyed the engine. So I was left with either $1,500 to get another K20 with a potential cracked block issue, or I should just go with a straight K24 for half the price of $750.
And so you have an aftermarket engine mount set up in this car. Does the K24 otherwise just drop right in?
For the most part, yes. You do need a CRV passenger side mount and just a little bit of modification. You just gotta move all the sensors over. You gotta move the wiring harness over, but all in all, it's a mostly plug and play situation. The ECU is also the stock the K20 ECU. You just gotta flash it with Flash Pro. And yeah, stock mounts. It's just got an Engel Stiffy what is it, torque mount? Torque damper, yes, exactly. And so like now the engine just feels even smoother for every single shift and doesn't buck as much inside the car.
Now longtime viewers of the channel will know all about my Civic Si. Again, 8th generation Civic FA5, totally stock K20 under the hood. The only mod I've done is a K9 air filter, which I'm sure is minus 10 horsepower. Otherwise, all the work I've done to my car is wheels, tires, suspension, brakes, handling stuff. That's why it is so fun to drive on the racetrack. Has a StopTech C43 Racing BBK on it. The 17x9, 17x8 front wheel drive stagger setup with 245 wide front tires and a 215 rear tire. And it has the somewhat awful Godspeed Monomax coilovers on it. All right, so right away, there are definitely some differences between our two cars. Just getting into Alex's FG2 is the first thing is the seating position. For whatever reason, his seat is much, much higher than mine. I'm not sure if this is a coupe versus sedan thing, or perhaps the fact that mine is a 2010 plus, the facelift model, and his is a pre-facelift model. But wow, I'm sitting really high up in this car. I mean, I almost don't have enough headroom in this thing, which is a very different experience from my sedan. With that out of the way, there's obviously the difference in the drivetrain. Now, Alex has a slightly stiffer clutch and a slightly different shifter setup than me. Mine is the 09 Plus OEM spec shifter here, and this has an aftermarket short shifter and a slightly heavier clutch. All right, with that out of the way, Alex is driving my car so you can get a feel for what a stock K20 feels like, because he hasn't driven a K20 Si in quite a long time, and I'm behind the wheel of his K24 swap Civic Si. Let's go for a drive. Oh, the clutches take some getting used to. So originally, Alex was gonna bring the K24 totally bone stock to me for a true apples to apples comparison. Unfortunately, with the K24 swap, it just made more sense for him to do a Honda ECU. He had to do the Honda ECU reflash anyway, so he may as well do a light tune on it to improve the drivability. Also, this has the hybrid racing intake, so it should make a little more gas than a standard SI. It sounds really good on throttle too. Now, Alex said that right before he came here, he hit the dyno really quick and his car made 188 wheel horsepower, which, if I'm honest, does sound a teeny bit low, but that could be a factor of the dyno itself. The big thing, however, is definitely the torque. A K24 just has so much more torque than a K20. And you really feel it here. I mean, you can just lean into this car at 3,000 or 4,000 RPM and it just pulls really nicely. And And I think that's what Alex is definitely after, because unlike me, he doesn't track his Civic. It's just a fun daily that he puts a lot of miles on. You know, he sits in traffic, he commutes across Southern California with this car, and the K24 definitely does kind of fit the mantra of a fun DD engine, because it's just so grunty off the line. Ooh, it sounds good too. You know, I'll be honest, I've never been a huge fan of the K24 on paper. And I think that's a bit unfair of me, because I kind of assumed, well, you don't get the super high RPM of a K20. It can't be as good or as fun. But to be honest, it just sounds like a more batshit K20. Now, for whatever reason, the exhaust note on this thing is brutal. Alex retained the completely stock 8th generation SI exhaust system. Now, for the 9th gen Civic Si, where they put a factory K24 in it, they had to redesign the exhaust. I'm assuming for acoustical reasons, because there's quite a lot of resonance in the exhaust piping. It's actually pretty intense. You can hear it when you come off throttle like that. It's just a sort of resonance through the exhaust pipes. You know, I'm sure it's some frequency or tonal difference in putting a K24 into that same exhaust stream. I caught a school bus on the crest. Man, that just pulls so nice from 2,000 RPM. It's funny, compared to the K20, when the K24 comes into VTEC, it's not nearly as pronounced. There's a tonal shift. It does sound slightly different, but it doesn't hit quite as hard as the K20 does when it comes onto the cam. Man, this does make me miss the Kony Tane setup. I ran this in the car before and actually really enjoyed it. I thought it was like one of the most like compliant aftermarket suspension setups on the road I've ever experienced, and it definitely shines here on the crest, which is a little bit bumpy. I told Alex to be careful, because by comparison, the God speeds on my car do not feel nearly as compliant and composed. Oh my God, look at that. Man, that was $7.5 grand. I have no idea what Alex redlined at. I think he said 7,600, but it just pulls really cleanly. I can see why he likes this. The linearity of the power delivery. You know, the horsepower delivery is completely linear, but the torque curve is almost completely flat. So it kind of feels almost the same at 5,000 RPM as it is at 7,000 RPM. Now, not everyone likes that, but Alex's background is actually driving like big SUVs and stuff like that. So the torque and the linearity of the power delivery is definitely to his liking. Do I like this more with my K20? I'm not sure. I know I like this hybrid racing intake and the tune that Alex has done on this thing. He's done a really good job. Him and a friend basically street tuned this car, and wow, credit to them, it pulls really nicely. The power is really smooth. Man, this thing's pretty good. It definitely takes getting used to effectively short shifting it, because I'm used to the gearing in my car with a higher red line. But I can't argue with the efficacy, though. The way this thing pulls at 4,000 RPM, I mean, it would just leave my K20 for dead. Man, it sounds good. Woof. With the price differential between a K20 and a K24, it does kind of seem to be a no-brainer. K20s aren't getting any cheaper, but man, Honda made so many K24s in so many different cars, JDM and domestic. The price differential, especially for a young guy, it does definitely give the edge to the K24. So this is really the difference right here after hopping out of Alex's car and hopping back into mine, is that I came back down here to fuel up for a second and get a drink, and off the line, my car feels like a total dog compared to his K24 swapped Civic Si. I mean, I would venture a guess that his K24 is making like 30 more foot-pounds of torque than mine, my K20, right out of the bat, and that really is power right off the line. I mean, from honestly, under about 5,000 RPM, the K20 is a very underwhelming engine, especially in a big, heavy car like the Civic Si. And so that's definitely the big difference, which is pretty obvious. But the more interesting thing, I think, is when you are really hustling these cars, and I mean driving them really hard, I think that, man, once this car is in VTEC, it's a real close race. I know the K24 makes a lot more torque, but once this thing gets up and going, I think the power differential really equals out. It really evens out. I mean, I would go as far as saying that over 7,000 RPM, my car feels faster. So I'm at a stoplight now. I'm going to roll into it in first gear so you can just see exactly what I'm talking about. Compared to the K24, the K20 just feels so anemic. Ready? 1500, floored it. There it goes. Man, once you're in VTEC, this feels as fast as Alex's car. But until you get there, man, I think he would just gap me for sure. I mean, it's interesting driving the cars back and forth where he was basically, you know, always in the third gear rev limiter trying to keep the car in the power band, and I was in his car, you know, I was using fourth gear, sometimes even fifth, because it has so much more usable power down low. And I would basically say a K24 is making as much torque at 3,000 RPM as this car makes ever. Peak torque is just over 6,000 RPM, and I would say the K24 is making that much power way down there. I think that, man, once you're really hustling it, this is more exciting. The K20, it is just more exciting to drive because the power is so explosive at the top. I mean, look at that. I mean, we're 7,300 RPM. It just still not even at the sweet spot yet, and he's really pulling hard. And it's less effective than the K24 for sure, but it's definitely more exciting. All right, so we are back. It's been a fun afternoon thrashing these two K-Series power cars through the canyons, but I'm really curious. I want to get Alex's opinion. He did the effort. He did the K24 swap on his Si. You know, what do you think about the two cars? It's been a while since you've driven a K20 car. You know, what do you like about your car? What do you like about my car? What do you dislike about your car? Dislike about my car? Kind of talk me through it.
Sure. Well, about the K20, I definitely missed the high revving RPMs. It definitely feels really fun to wind it out. However, if you're below VTEC, which in this case was 6,200 RPMs or so, you get nothing. And so, like, for me, I was just like lugging the engine around, you know, trying to keep up with Jake when he was driving my Si. But with the K24, when I was back into it, oh my gosh. The VTEC crossover is at 3,500 RPMs, that's how we tuned it. And from that point onwards, oh my gosh, it just merges with the top and just so smoothly. There's power all throughout the mid-range. I was in fourth gear at 5,000 RPMs and still keeping up with Jake just fine. So I definitely think that the intake and the tune really helped out. You don't even really need exhaust to really, you know, have fun with this thing. It's pretty fast as is already.
Well, that's what I noticed is, like, this car is so fun when you're in VTEC, but as soon as you fall out, I mean, I've had the issue on track before. If you're cornering really hard and the car falls out of VTEC, it will just not accelerate. It's a total dog. And so it's really exciting when you hit 6,000 RPM and come into VTEC and really chase the red line. But until you get there, this car feels really, really slow versus this thing, because effectively with VTEC being at 3,500 RPM, it's basically on all the time. It feels so much more immediate and so much faster at lower speeds. I mean, we were trading notes. You are basically banging up the rev limiter in third gear all the time, versus in this thing, I was short shifting and keeping it in fourth and sometimes even fifth gear because it has that much more torque. The drivability down low is just so much better. it's interesting seeing the differences between the FG2 and the FA5 because I've never really driven the coupe before. There are definitely some differences though. The big thing for me is definitely the interior and the seat. For whatever reason, his seat is like an inch higher than mine and I can't quite figure out why. But it's small differences like that that make this comparison really interesting. You know, FG2 versus FA5, K20 versus K24. And you know, both the cars have basic modifications, suspension modifications, things like that. Though I will say, getting out of your car and getting back into mine, the brakes and the tire package is definitely a huge difference. Not super important in the K20 versus K24 comparison, but just bombing through the canyons, the difference is very noticeable. We were talking off the camera and Alex definitely might be looking into a more aggressive tire setup in the near future because with this increased amount of power, I mean 188 wheel horsepower may not sound like a ton, but in a small car like this, it feels really urgent. What else? You mentioned the VTEC crossover at 3,500 RPM. And you mentioned before that like when it hits like 6,000 RPM, it almost like comes on VTEC again in a way, and you can definitely feel that when you drive your car. Oh yeah, definitely. So at 6,000 RPMs, you notice that the intake gets louder and the car pulls even harder, so it's getting to like the top end region of the RPMs. And we think it's probably because of the exhaust cams, it's climbing on cam, and so like the mid-range is pretty good, and thankfully the mid-range is enough to actually carry it onto the top end. So overall, I'd say that this is a more well-usable car. If you're the type of person who really likes to wind out the car and really just want to drive the piss out of it, get the K20. Stick with the K20. But if you want more usable power all throughout, you're okay with a 1,000 RPM deficit, go with the K24. I mean, it's half the price of a K20 direct swap if you blow your K20 just like what happened to me. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely hard to argue with the efficacy of the K24 because for so much more of the power band, it feels so much more faster, to be frank. I mean, I think when push comes to shove, if we were gonna roll race, not that we're gonna roll racing is illegal, don't do that on public roads, but I think if this car is like right at 8,000 RPM, you know, right at the rev limiter, it'd be really close. Until that point, you are gonna freight train me, and like by a huge, huge gap. At first I was like, it can't be that different, but driving this thing, I mean, the torque difference is so enormous in the real world. I think we covered it. Yeah. I think we did a pretty good job. We have two really fun Hondas in the canyons. We hit a lot of VTEC, probably burned a lot of oil because it's a Honda. But I think we've proven a point. If you have a fun daily driver and you blew up your K20, look into the K24. It's a lot cheaper and the drivability is so much better. The extra torque is really fun. But maybe if your SI is more of a weekend toy or a track car, kind of like mine is, you might stick with the K20. The high RPMs, when you're in the high RPMs, is really, really exciting. So I guess it's like, you know, pick what you like. There's no bad choice here. And I think that's a good way to wrap this video up. This has been a really fun comparison. Alex, thank you for bringing out your K24 swapped FG2. Follow him on Instagram. I'll have a link right here. You'll see his Instagram account right there. And thank you very much for watching, guys. And as always, my name is Jake. Keep watching Drive, Break, Fix, Repeat. And I'll see you guys next time where I go do more fun things with cars. Bye.
Mm-hmm.